are not serious about facts and what's true and what's not. And particularly in an age of social media where so many people are getting their information in sound bites and snippets off their phones. If we can't discriminate between serious arguments and propaganda, then we have problems.
Destroying alternative media is now a primary objective of the establishment. That's what so-called fake news is all about. It's an effort to get people to stop reading social media, countering propaganda put out by the establishment.
I've been a journalist for about 25 years, and I was educated to lie, to betray, and not to tell the truth to the public.
The government and its media say fake news and the Russians helped get Donald Trump elected. Donald Trump was elected because most Americans are sick and tired of the political class. It remains to be seen, though, if Donald Trump will do what he promised during the campaign. Facebook, Google, and Twitter agreed to work with the elite to scrub alternative media from their social media platforms.
Now Google and Facebook are targeting how the creators of these fake news sites make money. That's advertising. Google announcing overnight it will prevent websites that push phony news from using its AdSense advertising network, and Facebook announcing that it is updating policies to ban fake news. Those are important steps, Robin.
Facebook said in a statement it would vet all prospective publishers and monitor existing ones to ensure compliance. A shadowy and anonymous group calling itself PropOrNot surfaced after the election. It calls itself your friendly neighborhood propaganda identification service. It said alternative news websites are acting as Russian dupes or useful idiots. Here's the PropOrNot definition of propaganda: a systematic form of purposeful persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of specific target audiences for political, ideological, and religious purposes through the controlled transmission of deceptive, selectively omitting, and one-sided messages, which may or may not be factual, by mass and direct media channels. More than the alternative media, this description applies to large corporate media operations, most notably the New York Times and the Washington Post.
I've heard that ever since I was a young boy in America. That's always a national security. No, I believe governments lie. I think that they protect their own interests.
The New York Times peddled the lies put out by the Bush administration and its circle of neocons prior to the invasion of Iraq. The lies played on the emotions and patriotism of the American people. The lies included unsubstantiated claims Iraq was building nukes, that Saddam Hussein had bought yellow cake uranium in Niger, that Iraq was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, that Iraq had a fleet of drones that would be used to disperse chemical and biological weapons, and that Iraq had a massive stockpile of chemical and biological weapons.
What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts in Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
According to a poll conducted by the University of Maryland, nearly 50% of Americans believed lies put out by the neocons. In order to make sure these lies were not effectively challenged and coverage of the invasion went the way the Pentagon wanted, hand-picked journalists were embedded in the military. Other journalists were excluded and a few even targeted. In 2005, Eason Jordan, who was at the time the head of CNN's news division, said he knew of about 12 journalists who had not only been killed by American troops, but had been targeted as a matter of policy.
And I say this, that by taking this nation to war on a lie, all of the killings of American soldiers in Iraq became unlawful killings and therefore murder.
The U.S. government routinely invents lies to cover its false flag attacks. In addition to the lies about Saddam Hussein and Iraq, the government used its premier propaganda outlet, the New York Times, to lie about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never occurred. The lie about North Vietnam attacking U.S. ships was used to escalate the war in Vietnam.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, it is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
In total, more than 3 million people were killed in Southeast Asia by the U.S. military. More recently, the establishment lied about Syria and Libya. It blames Bashar al-Assad and the Russians for the carnage there. It refuses to mention that Assad tried to negotiate peace, and the Syrian constitution was changed in 2012 to end the Ba'ath Party monopoly on power. Assad offered amnesty to the so-called rebels, but this received little coverage. The New York Times and the establishment media consistently portray murderous Islamic radicals as moderates. The media also said Assad gassed his own people. It then refused to report the sarin attack in Syria was attributed to al-Qaeda. It also claims without a shred of evidence Assad and Russia are helping the Islamic State. The British House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee concluded the attack on Libya was based on lies. The U.S. government lied about Gaddafi's supposed threat to massacre civilians following the protests during the Arab Spring that was manufactured in the West. An Amnesty International investigation in June 2011 couldn't verify allegations of mass human rights violations by Gaddafi's troops. The British report says the establishment media presented a one-sided view of events. The media also didn't report the U.S. and its partners deliberately and knowingly pursued a policy that provided material support to terrorist organizations in order to topple Gaddafi.
The disastrous, absolutely disastrous intervention in Libya, the destruction of the Gaddafi government, which led to the occupation of ISIS, of large segments of that country, weapons flows going over to Syria, being pushed by Hillary Clinton into jihadists within Syria, including ISIS. That's there in those emails. There's more than 1,700 emails in Hillary Clinton's collection that we've released just about Libya alone.
The U.S. government has used the media for its war propaganda for more than 100 years. William Randolph Hearst worked with the government to get the Spanish-American War going. He ran sensationalistic stories about the Spanish occupation of Cuba to raise public support for the war. The Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers falsely reported the USS Maine was torpedoed or mined in the Havana harbor by Spain. It turned out the explosion that sunk the battleship was due to magazines ignited by spontaneous fire in a coal bunker. There wasn't any evidence the Spanish had anything to do with it. The Maine and sensationalistic lies about its sinking resulted in a war with Spain in 1898. The war was waged in Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. Over 200,000 Filipino civilians and 7,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. War propaganda became a science by the time the United States entered the First World War. President Woodrow Wilson established America's Committee on Public Information. It was run by the State Department and the Army and the Navy. The committee produced pro-war films, posters, books, and pamphlets. It purchased ads in all the major newspapers. The iconic "I Want You for the U.S. Army" poster was created during the war. Over 320,000 U.S. soldiers were killed before the war ended in 1918. During the Second World War, the media played a direct role in creating propaganda. FDR created the Office of War Information. It worked with the state and war departments and the media, including Hollywood, newspapers, and radio stations.
I'm a peace-loving guy myself. Oh boy, wait till the Admiral hears about this.
Zusammengestunken! Hitler geschwürgelt rüber. Ach du lieber, mein Herr, mein Pumpkin, mein Wild, mein heiliger
War propaganda became more sophisticated during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, especially after the introduction of television.
Never has so much military, economic, and diplomatic power been used so ineffectively as in Vietnam. If after all of this time and all of this sacrifice and all of this support, there is still no end in sight, then I say the time has come for the American people to turn to new leadership, not tied to the policies and mistakes of the past. I pledge to you, we shall have an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
This time, vote like your whole world depended on it.
In the early 1950s, the CIA created its Operation Mockingbird takeover of the corporate media. The foreign policy objectives of the ruling elite were disseminated by corporate newspapers and media. But the internet came along and changed everything. Alternative media now has a viable platform. By the late 1990s, dozens of sites were appearing weekly, challenging the corporate media. Every day, millions of people around the world get information that challenges the official narratives of government. The so-called fake news narrative is the latest attempt by the establishment to undercut the influence of alternative media. Facebook, Google, and other tech giants might soon be persuaded or forced by the government to implement technology that limits or eliminates the visibility of alternative media on the internet. The so-called fake news campaign went mainstream when the Washington Post published an article on PropOrNot in its website naming a large number of alternative news websites as fakes and useful idiots for Putin and the Russians.
I find this extremely worrying that all of a sudden we have to be listening to groups with dubious pedigrees, groups that purport to tell us what the difference is between truth and lie. And it's highly suspicious and completely inappropriate to a country that lives under the First Amendment.
The Washington Post might be considered the centerpiece of the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, the massive effort to control propaganda, misinformation, and fake news. Its publisher, Philip Graham, worked directly with the CIA. Is PropOrNot a CIA or intelligence front group? It's not known yet because they remain anonymous. Researchers are busy at work trying to figure out who they are. The fact the Washington Post snatched up the story and pushed it onto the national stage gives us a hint of what is really going on. If you find the Geopolitical Report informative, please consider making a contribution to Newsbud. We are 100% people-funded and don't take money from corporate advertisers, establishment foundations, or NGOs. With your support and encouragement, we'll continue to bring you news and information ignored and blacklisted by the corporate media. Thank you for your support.